1926 wedding photo restored, and historians notice a creepy detail. The autumn rain fell softly over Boston as Claire walked into her small restoration studio on Newbury Street. The morning air carried the scent of wet leaves and old brick, a familiar comfort as she unlocked the door and stepped inside. At 34, she had spent over a decade bringing old photographs back to life. Faded faces, cracked memories, stories frozen in silver and paper. Her studio was filled with the tools of her trade: magnifying lamps, archival papers, and computer screens displaying images from another century. But nothing in her years of experience had prepared her for what she was about to discover. That morning, a package had arrived from a law firm in Vermont. The cardboard box was unremarkable, addressed in neat typewritten letters, with no indication of the weight it carried. Inside was a wedding photograph dated October 17, 1926, along with a brief note. Found during estate settlement. Family requests digital restoration. Original to be returned. Claire carefully lifted the photograph from its protective sleeve and held it under her magnifying lamp, her trained eyes already assessing the damage. The image showed a bride and groom standing on the steps of a white church, surrounded by guests in their finest attire. The bride wore an elegant lace gown with a long train that pooled at her feet like spilled milk, her veil cascading over her shoulders in delicate waves. The groom stood tall beside her in a dark suit, his hand resting on her shoulder. Autumn leaves littered the church steps, and the guests wore expressions of joy and celebration. At first glance, it was a beautiful portrait of a 1920s wedding, the kind Claire had restored dozens of times before. She began the painstaking process of digitizing the image, scanning it at the highest resolution her equipment could manage. As the file loaded onto her computer screen, she zoomed in to assess the damage: the usual foxing, some silver mirroring along the edges, a small tear near the bottom corner. Standard work that would take perhaps a week to complete properly. But as she moved across the image, examining each face, each detail, something made her pause. She leaned closer to the screen, her breath catching in her throat. The bride's hands. There was something wrong with the bride's hands. Claire adjusted the contrast and sharpened the image, her fingers trembling slightly on the mouse. What she saw made her stomach turn. Beneath the delicate lace gloves, partially hidden by the bouquet of white roses, were dark marks around the bride's wrists, unmistakable bruises, like fingerprints pressed into flesh. And the groom's hand on her shoulder was not resting gently. His fingers were digging into her skin, gripping her as if she might try to escape. Claire sat back in her chair, her heart pounding against her ribs. She looked at the bride's face again. Really looked this time. The woman was smiling, but her eyes told a different story. They were empty, hollow. The smile of someone who had learned to hide her pain behind a carefully constructed mask. For a long moment, Claire simply stared at the screen. Who was this woman? What had happened to her? And why did this photograph, buried for nearly a century, feel like it was begging to be understood? She picked up her phone and called the law firm in Vermont. She needed to know more. The lawyer's voice on the phone was polite but unhelpful. He explained that the photograph had been found in the attic of a deceased client named Dorothy, an elderly woman who had passed away at 96 with no living relatives. The estate was being liquidated, and the photograph was simply one of many items being cataloged for auction or donation. No one at the firm knew who the people in the image were, and frankly, no one had bothered to ask. Claire thanked him and hung up, but she could not let it go. That night, she stayed late in her studio, the city lights of Boston twinkling through the rain-streaked windows as she researched everything she could find about wedding customs in 1920s New England. She examined the style of the dress, the cut of the groom's suit, the architecture of the church in the background. She was looking for anything that might help her identify the bride whose eyes had haunted her all day. By midnight, she had made her first breakthrough. The church in the photograph had a distinctive steeple, a rare octagonal design with Gothic arched windows that she traced to a small town called Havenbrook in rural Vermont, just 40 miles from where Dorothy had lived. The architectural style was unmistakable, documented in a 1912 survey of New England churches. Claire found a historical society website for Havenbrook and composed a careful email explaining what she had found, attaching the restored photograph and asking if anyone might recognize the location or the people pictured. 3 days later, she received a response from a woman named Margaret, the president of the Havenbrook Historical Society. Margaret was 72 years old and had lived in the town her entire life. She recognized the church immediately. It was St. Anne's, built in 1847 and still standing today, though it had been converted to a community center in the 1980s. But more importantly, she recognized the bride. Her name was Eleanor, Margaret wrote. Eleanor was one of the most beautiful women in Havenbrook. She came from a respected family. Her father owned the general store, and her mother was known for her charitable work. She married a man named Thomas in October 1926. It was considered the wedding of the decade, the social event that everyone talked about for months afterward. But Eleanor died 8 months later, in June 1927. The official cause was listed as a domestic accident. She fell down the stairs. She was only 23 years old. Claire read the email 3 times, her hands trembling against the keyboard. A domestic accident. She fell down the stairs. The words echoed in her mind as she looked again at the bruises on Eleanor's wrists, at the iron grip of Thomas's hand on her shoulder, at those empty, hollow eyes staring back at her from across nearly a century. She called Margaret immediately, not caring that it was past 10 o'clock at night. "I need to know everything about Eleanor," Claire said, her voice urgent. "Everything you can find." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "May I ask why you are so interested?" Claire took a deep breath and spoke the words that had been forming in her mind since she first saw those bruises. "Because I don't think her death was an accident, and I think this photograph proves it." Margaret was hesitant at first, and Claire could understand why. Eleanor's story was old history, she said, nearly 100 years buried and forgotten. The family, what remained of it, had long since left Havenbrook, scattered across the country like seeds in the wind. Digging up the past could be painful, could reopen wounds that time had mercifully closed. But something in Claire's voice convinced her. Perhaps it was the passion, or the certainty, or simply the fact that someone finally cared enough to ask questions that should have been asked decades ago. 2 weeks later, a package arrived at Claire's studio containing photocopies of documents Margaret had found in the Historical Society's archives. There were newspaper clippings announcing the wedding, church records documenting the ceremony, and a faded guest list written in elegant cursive. But the most important items were tucked at the bottom of the stack. A bundle of letters, yellowed with age and tied with a pale blue ribbon. The letters had been written by Eleanor to her childhood friend, a woman named Ruth, who had moved to Boston shortly before the wedding to work as a secretary. They spanned from September 1926, just weeks before the ceremony, to May 1927, 1 month before Eleanor's death. Margaret explained that Ruth had donated them to the Historical Society in 1973, shortly before her own passing, with instructions that they be preserved but not displayed. "She said the world was not ready to hear Eleanor's story," Margaret wrote. "Perhaps now it finally is." Claire read the letters in chronological order, sitting alone in her studio as the autumn darkness gathered outside. With each page, her heart grew heavier, and her suspicions hardened into something approaching certainty. In the earliest letters, Eleanor wrote about her upcoming wedding with a strange mixture of duty and resignation. "Thomas is a good match," she wrote in careful, looping script. "Father says I should be grateful. He is wealthy, respected, and will provide for me well. Mother says I will learn to love him in time, as she learned to love father. I suppose that is all a woman can ask for in this world." There was no mention of romance, no excitement about the future, no joy, only obligation. By November, the tone had shifted dramatically. Eleanor wrote of Thomas's temper, his jealousy, his need to control every aspect of her life. "He does not like when I speak to other men, even the grocer or the postman," she confessed. "He says I am his now, and I must behave accordingly. I try to be a good wife, Ruth. I try so hard, but I am beginning to fear I have made a terrible mistake." The letters from the winter months were darker still. Eleanor described arguments that ended with broken dishes and bruises she had to hide beneath long sleeves and high collars. She wrote of isolation. Thomas had forbidden her from visiting friends or attending church socials, claiming that a proper wife should find fulfillment in her home and husband alone. "I feel like a prisoner in my own home," she confessed in February. "The walls close in a little more each day, and I cannot breathe." The final letter, dated May 15, 1927, was the shortest and most heartbreaking of all. "He knows I tried to leave. He found the bag I had packed, hidden in the back of the closet. I have never seen him so angry, Ruth. His face was like a stranger's, someone I did not recognize. I am afraid of what he might do. If anything happens to me, please remember that I loved you. You were the truest friend I ever had, and please, do not let him erase me from this world." Claire set the letter down and wept, alone in her studio, mourning a woman who had died before her grandmother was born. Armed with the letters, Claire knew she needed more than personal testimony. She needed official records, the kind that could not be dismissed as hearsay or exaggeration. She contacted the Vermont State Archives and requested any documents related to Eleanor's death in June 1927. The archivist was helpful, but warned her that records from that era were often incomplete, especially for cases that had been closed quickly. Still, he promised to search. What she received 3 weeks later was a thin folder containing only 3 items: a death certificate, a brief police report, and a coroner's summary. Claire spread them across her desk and examined each one with the meticulous attention she usually reserved for damaged photographs. The death certificate listed the cause of death as accidental trauma to the head and neck, consistent with a fall from height. The coroner's summary was equally terse and clinical. Deceased was found at the bottom of the main staircase by her husband at approximately 7 a.m. on June 12, 1927. Husband reported that deceased had been feeling unwell the previous evening and must have fallen during the night while attempting to descend the stairs. Examination revealed injuries consistent with this account. No signs of foul play observed. Case closed. The police report was only 2 pages long, typed on paper so old it crumbled at the edges. The investigating officer, a man named Franklin, had interviewed Thomas on the morning of Eleanor's death. Thomas explained that his wife had complained of dizziness and headaches the previous evening, symptoms she had experienced intermittently throughout their marriage. He had gone to bed early, around 9 o'clock, leaving her reading in the parlor. When he woke at 7 and did not find her beside him, he went looking and discovered her body at the foot of the stairs, her neck twisted at an unnatural angle. He was described in the report as visibly distraught and fully cooperative with the investigation. Claire read the documents with growing frustration, her jaw clenched tight. The investigation had lasted exactly 3 days. No other witnesses were interviewed, no neighbors were questioned, no one asked about the state of the marriage, about Eleanor's well-being, about the bruises that must have been visible on her body. In 1927, a wealthy husband's word was apparently enough to close a case and bury the truth along with his wife. But then, Claire noticed something in the police report, a single line buried in the middle of a paragraph, so easy to overlook. Housekeeper present during initial interview. Did not provide statement due to emotional distress. A housekeeper. Someone else had been in that house, someone who lived under the same roof and might have seen what really happened behind those closed doors. Someone who had been too distraught, or perhaps too afraid, to speak. Claire immediately called Margaret and asked if there were any records of household staff in Havenbrook during the 1920s. There might be employment records in the church archives, Margaret said thoughtfully. Domestic workers often sought positions through parish connections back then. Give me some time, I will look. Claire hung up and stared at the death certificate on her desk. Eleanor had been 23 years old. She had been married for 8 months, and the only investigation into her violent death had been a 3-day formality that accepted her husband's story without question. It was time to find out what the housekeeper knew. Margaret's search through the church archives took nearly a month, but her persistence and dedication paid off in ways neither of them had anticipated. She found a parish employment record from late 1926 listing a woman named Agnes as a domestic worker, placed with the household on Maple Street, the address that had belonged to Thomas and Eleanor. According to the records, Agnes had been 26 years old at the time, unmarried, and had come to Havenbrook from a small farming community to the north, seeking better opportunities. Agnes had worked for the family from shortly after the wedding until 2 weeks after Eleanor's death, when she abruptly left her position without notice or reference. The church records noted that she had returned briefly to collect her final wages and then disappeared from Havenbrook entirely. No forwarding address was provided. Tracing Agnes proved far more difficult than Claire had hoped. She had apparently never married under that name, and the parish records ended in 1930 when she moved away from Vermont altogether. For weeks, Claire hit dead end after dead end, searching census records and immigration documents without success. She was about to give up when Margaret discovered something crucial, a birth certificate from 1928, filed in a neighboring town. Agnes had given birth to a daughter named Helen just 18 months after leaving Havenbrook. Using genealogical databases and public records, Claire traced Helen through marriage records, census data, property transactions, and eventually to a nursing home in Burlington, Vermont. Helen was 95 years old now, one of the oldest residents in the facility, but the staff assured Claire that her mind remained remarkably sharp. When Claire called and explained why she was reaching out, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. She could hear Helen's breathing, slow and measured, as if the old woman was deciding whether to speak. "I wondered if anyone would ever ask," Helen finally said, her voice thin but steady. "Mother told me the story when I was 16 years old, on the night before my wedding. She made me promise never to repeat it while certain people were still alive, people who could be hurt by the truth coming out. But they are all gone now. Everyone who could be hurt is gone, and I am 95 years old. If I do not tell someone soon, the truth will die with me." Claire drove to Burlington the very next day, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread in equal measure. She sat beside Helen's bed in the nursing home, a digital recorder on the nightstand between them, and listened as the old woman shared her mother's secret in a voice that trembled with the weight of decades. Mother was terrified of Thomas, Helen began, her aged hands clutching the bedsheet. She said he had a darkness in him, a coldness behind his eyes that could turn to rage without warning. Eleanor was kind to her, treated her like a friend rather than a servant, and Mother saw everything. The bruises Eleanor tried to hide with powder and long sleeves, the broken vase Eleanor claimed she had dropped but that Mother knew had been thrown. The nights Eleanor slept in the guest room because Thomas had locked her out of the bedroom as punishment for some imagined slight. Helen paused, her rheumy eyes growing distant with memory. The night Eleanor died, Mother was there. She heard everything. Claire leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. What did she hear? Helen closed her eyes. An argument, shouting that echoed through the house. Eleanor's voice, pleading and desperate, and then a scream, a terrible scream, followed by a sound like something heavy falling. And then silence. Mother hid in the kitchen, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. When Thomas came downstairs the next morning, calm as you please, he told her to clean up the blood at the bottom of the stairs and never speak of what she had heard. He said if she told anyone, he would destroy her. And she never went to the police? Helen shook her head slowly. Who would believe a servant girl over a wealthy man? Mother had no proof, no power, no voice in that world. She took the money Thomas offered her to leave quietly, and she carried the guilt of her silence for the rest of her life. It haunted her until the day she died. Claire returned to Boston with Helen's testimony carefully recorded and transcribed, her mind churning with everything she had learned. But she knew that one witness account, passed down through a generation and separated from the events by nearly a century, would not be enough to rewrite history. She needed more. She needed to prove that Thomas was not just a violent husband who had lost his temper once, but a calculating predator capable of premeditated murder. She began digging into Thomas's life before Eleanor, searching through newspaper archives, census records, and marriage registries with a determination that bordered on obsession. What she found sent chills down her spine and kept her awake at night. Thomas had been married once before Eleanor to a woman named Catherine in 1919. Catherine had been 19 years old, the daughter of a prosperous merchant family, and by all accounts, a gentle and trusting soul. She died in 1921, just 2 years into their marriage. The cause of death listed on her certificate, accidental drowning in the bathtub. She was 20 years old. Claire contacted the Historical Society in the town where Thomas and Catherine had lived, a small community in Massachusetts near the Vermont border. The records were sparse, but she found a newspaper clipping from August 1921 announcing Catherine's tragic death and praising Thomas for his remarkable strength and composure in the face of such devastating loss. There was no investigation, no inquest, no questions asked. Just another young wife dead under circumstances that defied common sense, and a grieving husband who inherited her family's money and moved on with his life. But that was not all. After Eleanor's death in 1927, Thomas had remarried for a third time in 1930 to a woman named Lillian, a widow with a modest inheritance from her first husband. Lillian was 25 when they married, described in the wedding announcement as radiant with happiness. She died in 1934, just 4 years later. The official cause, an accidental fall from a second-story window while cleaning the glass. She was 28 years old, 3 wives, 3 deaths, all ruled accidents by authorities who never looked beyond the obvious explanation, all under the age of 30. And Thomas had inherited substantial sums from each of them, building his wealth on a foundation of convenient tragedies. Claire sat in her studio late one night, surrounded by death certificates and newspaper clippings and photographs of 3 young women whose lives had been cut short. Her hands were shaking, and she felt physically ill as the full scope of what she had uncovered became clear. Thomas had not just killed Eleanor in a moment of rage. He had been a serial predator, a monster who married young women, isolated them from their families and friends, abused them behind closed doors, and ultimately murdered them for their money. And no one, not the police, not the coroners, not the neighbors or families, had ever connected the dots. She called Helen to share what she had discovered, her voice breaking as she described Catherine and Lillian. Mother always suspected there was more, Helen said quietly after a long silence. She said Thomas had the eyes of a man with no soul, eyes that looked at people like they were objects to be used and discarded. But she never knew about the others. Dear God in heaven, how many lives did that man destroy? Claire did not have an answer, but she was determined to make sure the truth finally came to light, no matter how long it had been buried. As Claire pieced together the dark tapestry of Thomas's history, she realized there was another thread she had not yet followed: the families of his victims. Catherine, Eleanor, and Lillian had all been daughters, sisters, perhaps aunts. They had been loved by people who mourned their loss and carried the weight of unanswered questions through generations. Somewhere out there, their descendants might still be wondering what really happened to their ancestors, still feeling the echo of those long-ago tragedies. She started with Eleanor's family, using the genealogical skills she had developed over years of tracing the subjects of old photographs. Through census records and immigration documents, Claire discovered that Eleanor had a younger brother named William, who had been only 18 when his sister died. According to the records, William had emigrated to California in 1930, just 3 years after Eleanor's death, leaving Havenbrook and never returning. He had married a woman named Rose, raised 3 children, and passed away in 1987 at the age of 78. But his granddaughter, a woman named Sarah, was still alive and living in San Diego. Claire spent 2 days composing the letter, choosing each word with care. She explained her research, described the photograph and what she had found in it, and included copies of Eleanor's letters to Ruth. She did not speculate about what had happened or make accusations. She simply presented the evidence and asked if Sarah would be willing to speak with her. 2 weeks later, her phone rang. Sarah's voice was thick with emotion from the very first word. "I always knew something was wrong," Sarah said, barely able to contain her tears. "My grandfather never spoke about his sister, not once in all the years I knew him. There was a photograph of her in his desk, a small portrait, the only one he kept, and whenever I asked about her, he would change the subject or leave the room. I thought it was just grief, the kind that never fully heals. I never imagined there was something more. I never imagined she had suffered like this." Claire shared everything she had uncovered: the bruises visible in the wedding photograph, the letters describing Thomas's escalating abuse, Helen's testimony about the night Eleanor died, and the horrifying pattern of deaths that followed. By the end of their conversation, both women were weeping. "She was only 23 years old," Sarah whispered. "She had her whole life ahead of her. Children she might have had, places she might have seen, people she might have loved. And that monster took everything from her. He took everything, and no one ever made him pay." Claire gave Sarah time to process, before gently asking if she would be willing to help bring Eleanor's story to the public. Sarah agreed without a moment's hesitation. "My great-aunt deserves to be remembered for who she was, not how she died," Sarah said firmly, her voice steadying with resolve. "And the world needs to know what Thomas really was: a predator, a murderer, a man who destroyed lives and was never held accountable." Over the following months, Claire tracked down descendants of Catherine and Lillian as well. Each family had their own version of the story: hushed whispers at holiday gatherings, unexplained silences when certain names were mentioned, old photographs hidden in attics and never displayed. And each of them, when they learned the full truth, wanted it to finally be told. With testimony, official records, and the support of the victims' descendants, Claire knew it was time to bring in an expert, someone with academic credentials who could verify her findings and help present them to a wider audience. She reached out to Dr. James, a professor of American history at Harvard University, who specialized in domestic violence, gender relations, and social justice in early 20th century America. His books on the hidden histories of marginalized women had won awards and changed the way scholars understood the past. Dr. James reviewed Claire's research with the meticulous eye of a scholar who had spent decades separating fact from fiction in historical records. He spent weeks examining Eleanor's letters, cross-referencing the death certificates with contemporary medical knowledge, and analyzing the social context of 1920s Vermont, a world where women had few legal protections and domestic violence was considered a private family matter, not a crime. When he finally called Claire, his voice was heavy with a mixture of professional admiration and personal sorrow. "What you have uncovered is extraordinary," he said. "Eleanor's letters are a rare and invaluable first-hand account of intimate partner violence in an era when such things were almost never documented. Women in her position had no language for what they were experiencing, no framework for understanding it as abuse rather than simply a difficult marriage. The fact that she wrote so candidly to her friend is remarkable." He paused, and Claire could hear him shuffling papers on the other end of the line. "The pattern of deaths among Thomas's wives is statistically almost impossible to explain as coincidence. 3 accidental deaths of young, healthy women married to the same man, each resulting in significant financial gain for the husband, each investigated only superficially, if at all. In any modern investigation, he would be the primary suspect from the moment the second wife died. But in that era, with those social attitudes, he was above suspicion simply because he was a man of means and reputation. Dr. James agreed to co-author an academic paper with Claire, presenting their findings to the historical community in a peer-reviewed journal. But he also suggested something more ambitious, a public exhibition that would bring Eleanor's story to life for ordinary people, not just scholars. "These women deserve more than a footnote in an academic journal," he said with conviction. "Their stories deserve to be seen, heard, and remembered by everyone." The photograph you restored is powerful visual evidence of what Eleanor was enduring on what should have been the happiest day of her life. Imagine what it could mean to survivors of domestic violence today, to see that their struggles are not new, that women have been fighting this battle for generations, and that their pain matters. Claire was deeply moved by the idea. She reached out to the Boston Museum of Social History, which agreed to host a small exhibition centered on Eleanor's story and the broader context of domestic violence in early America. The centerpiece would be the restored wedding photograph, displayed alongside Eleanor's letters, the official death certificates, and Helen's recorded testimony. As the exhibition took shape over the following months, Claire felt something shift inside her. This was no longer just a historical mystery she was solving. It was a reckoning with the past, and perhaps a small step toward justice. The exhibition opened on a cold evening in February, nearly a year after Claire had first received the photograph from the Vermont law firm. Snow was falling gently over Boston as guests arrived at the museum, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The gallery space was intimate, a single room with soft, carefully designed lighting and thoughtful curation. But the impact was immediate and profound, visible on the faces of everyone who entered. Visitors began their journey through a narrow hallway lined with enlarged details from the wedding photograph. The Gothic steeple of St. Anne's Church, the faces of the unsuspecting guests, and finally, the haunting close-up of Eleanor's gloved hands, the bruises faintly visible beneath the delicate lace-like shadows of violence frozen in silver and paper. At the end of the hallway, a simple placard read, "What you are about to see is the story of a woman whose truth was buried for nearly a century. Her name was Eleanor. She was 23 years old when she died. She deserves to be remembered." The main gallery displayed Eleanor's letters in glass cases, each one accompanied by a typed transcription for easier reading. The original wedding photograph hung under protective lighting, its restored details now visible in heartbreaking clarity. A comprehensive timeline traced Eleanor's life from her childhood in Havenbrook through her brief, tragic marriage. Audio stations positioned throughout the room allowed visitors to hear Helen's recorded testimony, her elderly voice filling the space with the weight of memory and long-held secrets finally spoken aloud. A separate section of the gallery detailed the deaths of Catherine and Lillian, presenting the pattern that Claire had uncovered through months of painstaking research. Photographs of all three women hung side by side, 3 young faces, 3 interrupted lives, 3 families who had never received answers until now. The response to the exhibition exceeded everyone's expectations. Local newspapers ran lengthy features, and national outlets picked up the story within days. Survivors of domestic violence reached out to Claire personally, sharing their own experiences and thanking her for giving voice to a woman who had been silenced for so long. Historians praised the rigor of the research, and several universities requested copies of the materials for their archives and teaching collections. But the most powerful moment of the exhibition came on its second night. A woman in her 70s approached Claire after spending nearly an hour in the gallery, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She introduced herself quietly, almost apologetically, as Thomas's great-granddaughter. "I never knew," she said, her voice trembling with shame and sorrow. "My family always spoke of him as a respectable man, a pillar of the community, someone to be proud of. No one ever told me what he did. No one ever mentioned Eleanor or Catherine or Lillian. I am so sorry for what he was. I am so deeply, deeply sorry." Claire took the woman's hands in hers and held them gently. "You are not responsible for his actions," she said. "The sins of our ancestors do not belong to us. But you are here now, bearing witness to the truth. And that means something. That means everything." In the months following the exhibition, Eleanor's story continued to ripple outward like stones dropped in still water, touching lives that Claire had never anticipated. The academic paper she and Dr. James co-authored was published in a leading history journal, sparking serious discussions among scholars about how domestic violence had been systematically erased from historical records and how many other stories like Eleanor's remained buried in archives, waiting to be discovered. A documentary filmmaker approached Claire about adapting Eleanor's story for screen, wanting to bring it to an even wider audience. Several high schools and universities incorporated Eleanor's letters into their curricula as a teaching tool about gender, power, silence, and the importance of listening to voices that history has tried to forget. Support groups for survivors of domestic abuse used the exhibition materials in their programs, showing that the struggle was not new and that speaking out, even decades later, could still matter. But for Claire, the most meaningful outcome of her year-long journey was something quieter and more personal. On a warm spring afternoon, when the snow had finally melted and the first flowers were beginning to bloom, she drove to Havenbrook, Vermont for the first time. The town was smaller than she had imagined, a cluster of brick buildings and white-steepled churches nestled in a valley surrounded by green hills. She walked slowly through the town square, past the old storefronts and the converted church where Eleanor had been married almost a century ago. She imagined the young bride walking these same streets, dreaming of a future that would never come. She found the cemetery on a hill overlooking the valley, shaded by ancient oak trees whose branches swayed gently in the breeze. She walked among the weathered headstones, reading names and dates until she found what she was looking for, a simple granite marker bearing Eleanor's name, her birth year, and her death year. Nothing more. No epitaph, no words of love or remembrance, just a name and 2 dates, as if the 23 years between them had meant nothing at all. Claire knelt beside the grave and placed a bouquet of white roses against the stone. The same flowers Eleanor had held in her wedding photograph, the same flowers that had hidden the bruises on her wrists. She stayed there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the leaves and the distant song of birds. "I found you," she whispered finally. "I told your story, and I promise you, Eleanor, you will not be forgotten. Not anymore. Not ever again." As she walked back to her car, Claire thought about the photograph that had started it all, a single image, frozen in time, that had waited nearly 100 years to reveal its truth. She thought about Eleanor's letters, her quiet courage in documenting her suffering even when she believed no one would ever read her words. She thought about Agnes, the housekeeper who had carried the burden of what she witnessed in terrified silence. And she thought about Helen, 95 years old and finally able to speak the secret her mother had entrusted to her. History, Claire realized, is not just the story of the powerful and the celebrated. It is also the story of those who were silenced, erased, and forgotten. The women who suffered behind closed doors, the servants who saw everything but could say nothing, the families who buried their grief along with their questions. And sometimes all it takes is one photograph, one curious mind, and the willingness to look closer, to bring their stories back into the light. Eleanor's photograph now hangs in the Havenbrook Historical Society, a permanent reminder of a life cut short and a truth that refused to stay buried. Beside it, a small brass plaque reads, "In memory of Eleanor, Catherine, and Lillian, and all those whose voices were stolen, may we learn to listen."